Woven fabrics. Let's take a look at how yarns are made into fabrics. We saw earlier that fibers are created into the yarns, and the yarns will then be fabricated or woven or knit into fabrics. Fabrics are used to make various end products like clothes or interior furnishings. Yarns are woven into a fabric on a loom. Woven fabric has two or more sets of yarns interlaced at right angles. Here are an example of a simple shuttle loom on the right-hand side, and on the left is an example of a more modernized industrial shutter loom. Woven fabric consists of warp yarns and weft, or also referred to as filling yarns. The weaving occurs when two or more yarns are interlaced together at right angles to make a fabric. Interlacing is when one yarn changes from one face of the fabric to the other. Woven fabrics are usually strong and easy to sew on. They are the suggested type of fabric for beginner sewers to use. Please see page 137 in your textbook for a more labeled diagram and explanation of a basic loom. The characteristics of woven fabric: you need to understand grain and what that means. Your fill direction is the lengthwise grain. It runs parallel to the selvage edge. It is the stronger of the grain lines and is referred to as the warp threads. The crosswise grain line is at right angles to the lengthwise threads and is referred to as the weft threads. Bias is a diagonal angle that runs at a 45 degrees to the warp and the weft threads. When garments are cut with their grain line of that pattern piece positioned on the bias, it will provide a little stretch to those pieces. Your warp and filling yarns are interlaced. That is when one yarn changes position from one fabric side to the other. The number of warp and filling yarns in a square inch, or sometimes a square centimeter, is referred to as the thread count. The magnifying glass that came with your swatch kit is a 1-inch square and will allow you to count the number of yarns in a square inch. The balance of a woven fabric is the ratio of the warp to filling yarns in the fabric, not the actual count. And your fabric weight is another way to describe how much the fabric weighs for a given area or length of fabric, and it is related to the end use and fabric names. Your lightweight, or also referred to as top weight fabrics, are best suited for shirts, blouses, dressings, and linings. Your medium weight are a little bit stiffer but can still be used for shirts, blouses, and dresses, and some of your summer weight bottoms. The heavyweight or bottom weight refers to fabrics suited for skirts, pants, shorts, jackets, and suits. Sometimes your heavyweight or bottom weights might also be referred to as suit weight. On page 142, look at the learning activity. It asks you to identify the warp and filling yarns in fabric 108 from your swatch kit. Can you tell if it is on grain? Use a ruler and the magnifying glass. It's also called a pick glass that came with your swatch kit to determine the warp and the filling count. Can you tell if it is a balanced count? One way to determine your warp and filling is to carefully examine that fabric in the lengthwise and crosswise yarns. Now, if you have the full piece of fabric in front of you, your warp direction always runs parallel to the selvage edge, but your swatches are cut from fabric so you don't have the selvage edge. How would you be able to tell the difference? Warp yarn count is usually higher than the filling yarn count. Warp yarns usually have lower elongation and lie straighter and more parallel in the fabric because of the loom tension. Warp yarns usually have a higher twist, a smaller size, and a more regular structure and appearance. Your fancy or special functioning yarns are usually in the filling direction. Watch for fabric characteristics that differ between the warp and filling directions, such as filling ribs that are in poplin and warp floats in satin. And a fabric crimp is usually greater for filling yarns that curve over or under warp yarns. If present in one direction only, yarn dyed stripes tend to be in the warp direction. There are several types of basic or simple weaves. The most common are plain weaves, a balanced plain weave or unbalanced plain weave, twill weaves, and satin weaves. Next, I will give you a list of some of the different fabrics that fit into these different categories. But you will have a activity this week. It's at the lower part of my course connection page, and it is a weaving activity. You've been supplied in your kit with paper pages that you will cut up according to the demonstration video, and you will weave together in 3 examples of this to kind of get a hands-on feeling of what these each are. But of your plain weaves, we have balanced plain weaves, unbalanced plain weaves, and then some that are basket weaves. In the balanced plain weaves, there are quite a lot of fabrics that fall into this, everything from lightweight, medium weight, to heavyweight. And as a designer, you need to know what the names of these fabrics are. If you will look at your textbook from pages 143 all the way to the end of the chapter, actually, when referring to these different fabric names, so that you can get a description of each of the fabric types is very important, because when you need to search for something on the internet, you need to know what to type in to get the type of fabrics you're looking for. Or if you've come across a type of fabric and it's given in the description the name of that fabric, you need to be able to visualize and understand how that fabric would react in your design. How is it going to drape? How's it going to feel next to the skin? Is it the right weight for the apparel garment piece that you are trying to use it for? It's great if the color works, but if none of these other characteristics will work for your design, then you will make a poor choice. But our balanced plain weaves can be a voile, a georgette, a chiffon, organza, batiste, a china silk, a challis, a print cloth, a percale, calico, muslin, gingham, chambray, ripstop nylon, crash, burlap, flannel, and tweed. All of these could either have a very stiff characteristic or a very soft drapable one. In your unbalanced plain weaves, you will find crepe de chine, broadcloth, taffeta, shantung, poplin, file. Basket weaves, we have duck, canvas, Oxford cloth, and sailcloth. There are several types of twill weaves. A twill fabric is where each warp or filling yarn floats across 2 or more filling or warp yarns with the progression of interlacing by one to the right or to the left, forming a very distinct diagonal line referred to as a wale. The twill weave will often be written as a fraction. The top number is the number of harnesses that are raised, and the bottom number is the number of harnesses that are lowered with a filling yarn is inserted. Some examples of even-sided twills are a foulard, a twill flannel, a herringbone, and a houndstooth. And warp-faced twills have a higher amount of warp yarns on the face, and since warp yarns are stronger with a higher twist, these fabrics are stronger and more abrasion and pill resistant. Twill flannel and herringbone can also be warp-faced twills, usually with a 2-1 pattern. The warp-faced twills described here are 2-1 twills unless otherwise noted. These are described in your textbook on page 150 and 151. But the lining twill a denim, chino, gabardine, and fancy twills are all examples of a warp-based twill. And our other basic weave is a satin weave. The satin weaves have warp yarn floats over 4 filling yarns or more and interlaces with the 5th filling yarn, with a progression of interlacings by 2 to the right or the left of each filling yarn. These usually have a very high shiny surface. They're not very abrasion resistant, and typically they will utilize filament threads rather than spun threads, but some of them will still use a spun thread. Your satin weaves or fabrics can be referred to as a satin, a crepe back satin where there's a distinct difference between the front side of the fabric and the back, and actually used in designs with both sides showing gives different textures with the same colors. Antique satin, a sateen, a filling sateen, and a warp sateen. Again, you can refer to the descriptions in your book on page 152 and 153 for these fabrics. There are several types of complex weaves. And these types of weaves create a pattern in the woven yarns. They are called a dobby weave and a jacquard weave. They are each created on a loom by the same name. After you take a look at the different names of these fabrics, can you find some examples in your swatch book? A dobby weave is a small figured design requiring fewer than 25 different warp arrangements to complete one design repeat. Many dobby fabrics include small geometric figures used in apparel and in interiors. And some examples of the dobby weaves are a madras, a waffle cloth, a piqué, a Bedford cloth, a bark cloth, momme, double-faced fabrics, and pocket cloths. Now a jacquard weave have large figured and elaborate designs that require more than 25 different arrangements of the warp yarns to complete one repeat of the design and are made on a jacquard loom. Some of these fabrics are referred to as a damask, a brocade, a tapestry, or a matelassé. Your different selvage edges of the fabric where the filling yarns wrap back around the end of the warp yarns create different edges, and different looms will finish them off differently. Here's some examples of them. Pile fabrics are another type of fabric where has a three-dimensional construction made by weaving an extra set of warp or filling yarns into the ground weave that make up short surface loops or can be finished with a cut end. The surface end can produce a very soft feel to it. Some examples of cut pile is velveteen and velvet. An uncut pile is terry cloth, example of that. And when you have cut cut yarns in a fabric, it's referred to as a nap because many times you brush them one direction, it will have a more dull look. You brush it a different direction, it may have a shinier look. Nap fabrics will have a fibrous surface produced by brushing up the fibers on the cloth during a textile finishing process. We'll look more in depth at that next week. When using a layout with patterns, you need to use a nap layout where all the pattern pieces are oriented in the same direction. That is the end. Thank you.